Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee. As he was entering a village, 10 lepers met him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voice, saying, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." As they were going, they were cleansed. And one of them, realizing he had been healed, returned, glorifying God in a loud voice. And he fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus said in reply, 10 were cleansed, were they not? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner turned to give thanks to God? He said to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith saved you." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Today is the feast of St. Albert the Great. St. Albert the Great, or Albertus Magnus, right, as he's called in Latin. He's one of the most kind of interesting saints, I think, especially of the Middle Ages. St. Albert the Great is the patron saint of scientists, and the reason why he is the patron saint of scientists is because he was a scientist himself. He was a bishop and a professor, and he wasn't just a professor of theology and philosophy, he was a professor of science, and so he was regularly performing experiments. And it's kind of surprising for many of us when we hear about a man living in the 1200s, right, to have so much experience in different experiments, in biology, in zoology, in alchemy, and all sorts of different things. And so I encourage you just to do a little research on St. Albert the Great. It's really impressive how extensive his knowledge of the different sciences was. St. Albert the Great is also famous because he was a beloved professor of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas, basically known as the greatest philosopher and theologian, right, in church history. St. Albert the Great was his professor. St. Albert the Great saw great potential in him when he taught him. The story goes that St. Thomas Aquinas was in his class, and he didn't really say a whole lot in class. He was very quiet. So some of the other students began to tease him, right? And they called him the dumb ox, right? Because he didn't say much. And St. Albert the Great famously told those students that that dumb ox would one day bellow so loudly that the whole world would hear him. And of course, that is very true. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most well-known saints and thinkers in all of world history. Now, I think what's also interesting about St. Albert the Great, and we were kind of talking about this last night in our theology class, is St. Albert the Great was alive and one of the key players in a moment of decision in church history. Living in the 1200s, he was living during the days of the Crusades. And one of the things that happened during the Crusades is that there was a debate not only about religion, but about God. And I personally believe that this debate has had consequences on all the subsequent centuries. I believe that this debate is at the heart, for example, of why Western civilization has distinguished itself in many ways from the rest of the world. It was because of this debate that took place in the 1200s. Basically, during the Crusades, the Christians encountered many different Muslim thinkers and philosophers. And they learned that those Muslim thinkers and philosophers, they were highly devoted to the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, who lived back in the 300s BC, he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And in Christianity, in the West, Aristotle had largely been forgotten by the Christians. And so there was a question: how much should we be adopting this pagan thinker's ideas into Christianity? There was some hesitancy upon members of the church about embracing this pagan, this non-Christian philosopher, especially since the Muslims loved him so much. St. Thomas Aquinas, for a while, his writings and teachings were actually suspect and being censored because he was embracing Aristotle so much, following the lead of his teacher, St. Albert the Great. And the reason why I think this debate was so significant is because eventually St. Thomas Aquinas was able to convince the great thinkers of his age that Aristotle had much to offer the church. Ultimately, in Islam, thinkers gradually began to move away from the thoughts of Aristotle. They moved away from the thoughts of Aristotle because they began to think that they needed to emphasize revelation and theology over natural philosophy. And I would say as well that Martin Luther and many other Protestants at the time of the Protestant Reformation, they moved away from Aristotle. And they returned to thinkers like Augustine and Plato, who was very influential on Augustine. And you may think this seems like some abstract philosophical debate, but one of the best ways to think about it is a famous painting by Raphael, which is in the Vatican. Right? It's called the School of Athens. And we don't have it here, but it's in the Newman Center. But basically, at the center of this painting, you have two men. One is Plato and one is Aristotle. And Plato is pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle is pointing to the earth. Essentially, that's kind of an oversimplistic way of thinking about it, but Aristotle was very focused on things that were very earthly. He himself was the most accomplished scientist of his own age. Plato tended to think much more abstractly about things. And you can see in their followers and their disciples, right, how that influences them. For example, in Protestantism, which is very much influenced by this Platonic way of thinking, you don't often hear Protestants talking about things like natural law. Instead, they talk about the Bible. As Catholics, we talk about the Bible, but we also have a great understanding and appreciation for natural law, natural knowledge, the study of the sciences. In Islam, as they were embracing these writings of Aristotle, they became very technological and scientifically advanced. That's one of the reasons why Islam was the dominant world force in the world up until the 1500s and 1600s. But eventually they began to go away from that appreciation for the sciences and knowledge. Whereas Catholicism became much more and more embracing of the pursuit of reason and knowledge and philosophy. And I would argue that that's one of the reasons why our civilization in the West has become so scientifically and technologically advanced. Because in the 1200s, the appreciation of reason, it won out. And it has been influencing Western civilization ever since.